October 14, 1944. The Vosges Mountains of eastern France. Through morning mist that clung to pine trees like ghostly fingers, 3,000 American soldiers waited for an order that would either make them heroes or corpses. They had no way of knowing that their survival would depend not on what their commander said, but on what he chose never to speak. The 402nd Regimental Combat Team, the most decorated unit in U.S. military history, found itself trapped in a nightmare of tactical impossibility. For 5 brutal days, they had been surrounded by German forces who controlled every ridge, every pathway, every escape route through terrain that seemed designed by the devil himself for defensive warfare. The men, mostly Japanese Americans fighting to prove their loyalty to a country that had imprisoned their families, faced annihilation with the stoic courage that had carried them through every previous impossible mission. But this morning was different. This morning brought radio messages from divisional headquarters that would test something far more dangerous than physical courage, the moral courage to disobey direct orders when those orders meant certain death. Colonel James Morrison stood in his command bunker, carved hastily into the rocky mountainside, staring at communication equipment that crackled with static and the voices of men who had never seen the battlefield they were so eager to discuss. The brass, safe in their headquarters 30 miles behind the lines, had studied maps and calculated probabilities with the cold precision of accountants balancing ledgers. Their solution was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. Attack at dawn, take Hill 617 by direct assault, no artillery support available, no air cover possible due to weather conditions, just 3,000 men charging uphill against entrenched German positions that commanded perfect fields of fire across open ground. The textbooks called it aggressive offensive action. The soldiers called it suicide. Morrison had seen enough battles to recognize a death sentence disguised as military strategy. The German defenders held positions that would have impressed the engineers who designed medieval castles. Interlocking fields of fire, multiple fallback positions, and high ground that turned every advance into a shooting gallery. Even if his men somehow reached the German lines, they would arrive too depleted and disorganized to hold what they had taken. Yet the orders were crystal clear, transmitted through proper channels with proper authentication codes. Attack at 0600 hours, no delays acceptable. Success essential for the broader offensive. Morrison was to acknowledge receipt and confirm execution within 30 minutes. The colonel looked at his watch. 5:30 a.m. In 30 minutes. He would need to speak the words that would send 3,000 men to their deaths, or he would need to find the courage to remain silent and face the consequences of what the military called failure to execute lawful orders, a court-martial offense that could end his career and land him in federal prison. Around him, his staff officers waited with the tense anticipation of men who understood that history pivots on moments like these. They had seen their commander wrestle with difficult decisions before, but this was different. This was the kind of choice that defined not just military careers, but the moral character of the men who made them. Through the bunker's observation slit, Morrison could see his soldiers preparing for what they assumed would be another day of defensive fighting. They cleaned weapons with the methodical precision of professionals, shared photographs of families they might never see again, and wrote letters they hoped would never need to be mailed. They trusted their officers to use their lives wisely, not to waste them on impossible objectives dreamed up by men who measured success in map coordinates rather than human lives. The radio crackled again, headquarters demanding confirmation. The clock showed 5:45 a.m. 15 minutes to decide whether to speak the words that would echo across 3,000 families, or to find the strength to let silence speak louder than any order ever could. What happened in those final 15 minutes would challenge everything the military believed about command, obedience, and the terrible mathematics of acceptable loss. Morrison was about to discover that sometimes the greatest act of leadership is knowing when not to lead, when the most courageous thing a commander can do is absolutely nothing at all. Colonel James Morrison hadn't begun the war as a revolutionary. He had been molded by West Point's rigid traditions, shaped by a system that prized obedience above all other virtues. For 22 years, he had followed orders without question, climbing the ranks through a combination of tactical brilliance and unwavering loyalty to the chain of command. But war has a way of revealing who men really are beneath their uniforms and training. Morrison had grown up in rural Montana, where silence was a language spoken as fluently as English. His father, a rancher who had fought in the trenches of France during the Great War, had taught him that sometimes the most important decisions were the ones you chose not to make. "There's wisdom in knowing when to act, son," the old man had said, "but there's greater wisdom in knowing when to wait." Now, surrounded by maps that showed his regiment's hopeless position with clinical precision, Morrison found himself remembering those words. The tactical situation was beyond desperate. It was mathematically certain death dressed up in the language of military necessity. 3,000 men against an entrenched enemy force that held every conceivable advantage. No supporting artillery, because the Germans controlled the only roads that could bring up heavy guns. No air support, because autumn storms had grounded every aircraft within 100 miles. But headquarters demanded action. The broader offensive required the Feuilles to take Hill 6 from 17, regardless of casualties. The men who gave these orders had never seen the killing ground that lay between Morrison's position and the German lines, an open slope where every man would be visible to enemy gunners from the moment he left cover until the moment he died. Morrison's executive officer, Major Robert Chen, stood quietly beside the radio, understanding without words the weight of the moment. Chen had fought alongside Morrison since North Africa, had seen him make split-second decisions under fire that saved hundreds of lives. But this was different. This wasn't about tactical genius or battlefield improvisation. This was about whether a career soldier had the moral courage to disobey direct orders when those orders violated everything he believed about the value of human life. The colonel picked up a battlefield telephone and placed a call to Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto, commander of the 2nd Battalion, the unit that would spearhead any assault on Hill 617. Yamamoto's voice came through the static, with the flat professional tone of a man who had already calculated the odds and accepted them. "Sir, the men are ready. We understand the mission requirements. First light is in 10 minutes. Morrison could hear unspoken questions in Yamamoto's voice. The lieutenant colonel wasn't asking for orders. He was asking whether his commander truly intended to sacrifice 800 men on a slope that every military manual would classify as unsurvivable terrain. Yamamoto was giving Morrison one last chance to reconsider, one final moment to find an alternative that wouldn't require so many funeral telegrams. "Stand by for further orders," Morrison replied, his voice carefully neutral. He set down the telephone and looked at the radio that connected him to divisional headquarters. One transmission would set everything in motion. Failure to transmit would probably end his military career, but it might save 3,000 lives. Major Chen cleared his throat softly, a sound that carried volumes of meaning between men who had served together for 2 years. "Sir, weather reports indicate fog may persist until mid-morning. Visibility is currently less than 50 yards. Conditions are unsuitable for offensive operations." It was a lifeline, expertly thrown. The fog was real, though it wouldn't last long enough to matter. But it provided Morrison with plausible justification for delay, a reason to wait that wouldn't immediately brand him as insubordinate. Chen was offering his commander breathing room, time to think of alternatives that might not exist. Morrison walked to the bunker's observation post and peered through the periscope at the German positions. Through gaps in the fog, he could see muzzle flashes from enemy machine guns conducting routine harassment fire. Each flash represented another reason why the attack would fail. The Germans were alert, well-positioned, and completely ready for exactly the kind of frontal assault that headquarters had ordered. But fog wouldn't save his men. Weather conditions wouldn't change the fundamental tactical reality. Even if Morrison delayed the attack for hours, the outcome would be the same when the order finally came. 3,000 men would advance into killing, fields that would consume them as efficiently as any industrial furnace. The radio crackled again, headquarters demanding immediate confirmation of attack orders. The operator's voice carried the impatience of staff officers who measured war in schedule requirements rather than human cost. Morrison looked at his watch. 5:58 a.m., 2 minutes until the scheduled assault time, 2 minutes to find the courage to commit what the manual called the gravest sin a soldier could commit: disobedience of direct orders in the face of the enemy. What Morrison chose to do in those final minutes would echo through military history as the moment when silence became the loudest sound on any battlefield. 6 a.m., October 14th, 1944. The moment when 3,000 lives hung in the balance of words never spoken. Colonel Morrison stood motionless beside the radio, his finger hovering over the transmission button that would unleash hell upon his own men. Around him, his staff waited in suffocating silence, understanding that they were witnessing either the greatest act of military insubordination in American history or the most courageous decision a commander had ever made. The static from the radio seemed deafening in the cramped bunker. Somewhere in that electronic noise were the voices of generals demanding action, staff officers checking schedules, and radio operators waiting for confirmation codes that would transform living soldiers into casualty statistics. But Morrison's voice remained locked in his throat, held there by something stronger than military discipline, the weight of 3,000 souls who trusted him not to waste their lives on impossible missions. Through his periscope, Morrison could see the fog beginning to lift, revealing the German positions in terrifying detail. Machine gun nests positioned with mathematical precision to create overlapping fields of fire. Mortar teams with pre-plotted coordinates covering every possible route of advance. Artillery spotters with direct telephone lines to battery positions that could drop shells within seconds of any movement on the American side. Major Chen stepped quietly beside his commander, understanding without words the magnitude of the moment. "Sir," he whispered, "the men in 2nd Battalion are asking for clarification. Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto reports his assault teams are in position and awaiting final orders." Morrison nodded without speaking. His men were ready to die because they trusted him to use their deaths for something meaningful. 800 soldiers crouched in shallow foxholes, checking ammunition they would never have time to fire, adjusting equipment that would become their burial shrouds. They waited for the word that would send them racing uphill toward machine guns that would cut them down before they covered 50 yards. The radio crackled again, more insistent now. "Bushido 6, this is Eagle Base. Acknowledge receipt of attack orders. Confirm execution time. Over." The code names felt obscene in their casual efficiency. Bushido 6, Morrison's call sign, chosen by staff officers who thought it clever to name a Japanese-American regiment after samurai traditions. Eagle Base, divisional headquarters, where men who had never heard a bullet in anger planned the deaths of soldiers they would never meet. Morrison's communication sergeant looked up expectantly, headphones positioned to receive the transmission that would either confirm the attack or... What? What happened when a colonel simply refused to acknowledge orders that would slaughter his regiment? The military justice system had procedures for insubordination, but those procedures assumed commanders who argued or refused outright. They didn't account for the deeper form of resistance, the choice to simply remain silent when silence meant salvation. 6:05 a.m. 5 minutes past the scheduled assault time. In those 5 minutes, Morrison had committed his first act of passive rebellion against orders he knew were wrong. But headquarters wouldn't wait much longer before demanding explanations that could only end with court-martial proceedings and federal prison. Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto's voice came through the field telephone, carefully professional but edged with growing confusion. "Bushido 6, 2nd Battalion requests clarification. Do we proceed with scheduled assault? Men are in position and ready to advance on your command." Morrison took the telephone with steady hands that betrayed none of the turmoil in his mind. These were the moments that defined military careers and human souls. Yamamoto deserved an answer. 800 men deserved to know whether they would live through breakfast. But giving that answer meant choosing between the careers of officers and the lives of soldiers. "Yamamoto," Morrison said quietly, "hold position. Maintain readiness, but do not advance without explicit authorization. Weather conditions remain unsuitable for offensive operations." It was true enough. Fog still clung to portions of the slope, though it was rapidly dissipating. More importantly, it was language that Yamamoto would understand. "Hold position. Don't advance. Find reasons to wait." Morrison was buying time he didn't have for alternatives that might not exist, but time was running out with each crackle of the radio. "Bushido 6, this is Eagle Base. You are now 7 minutes past scheduled assault time. Confirm immediate execution of orders, or provide detailed explanation for delay. This is a direct order requiring immediate compliance." The words carried the full weight of military authority. Immediate compliance. No more ambiguity, no more weather reports, no more tactical considerations. Morrison was being ordered to order his men to die, and failure to comply would brand him forever as the colonel who refused to follow orders when his country needed him most. Morrison looked around the bunker at faces that revealed everything and nothing. Major Chen, who had thrown him the lifeline of weather conditions. Sergeant Rodriguez, the radio operator who had heard every desperate transmission from headquarters. Captain Williams, the intelligence officer who had calculated the precise percentage of casualties the assault would produce. All of them understanding that their commander was choosing between his honor as a soldier and his responsibility as a human being. But perhaps the most extraordinary thing about that moment wasn't Morrison's silence, it was the silence of his staff. Not one officer suggested he follow orders. Not one man reminded him of military protocol or the consequences of disobedience. They had all seen the tactical situation. They all understood what the assault would accomplish. Nothing except the systematic destruction of the finest regiment in the American Army. 6:10 a.m. 10 minutes of silence that was growing louder than any artillery barrage. 10 minutes during which Morrison was redefining what it meant to command soldiers in an age when following orders sometimes meant betraying everything military service was supposed to represent. The radio erupted in angry static. This time the voice belonged to a general, the kind of authority that could destroy careers with a single phone call. But Morrison had already made his choice. He would not speak the words that would send 3,000 men to pointless deaths. History would judge whether his silence was cowardice or the greatest act of military leadership since Valley Forge. 6:15 a.m. 15 minutes of silence that would rewrite military doctrine and challenge every assumption about command authority in modern warfare. Colonel Morrison had crossed a line that no career soldier was supposed to cross, and the consequences were cascading through the chain of command like a seismic shockwave. The radio now carried the voice of General Patterson himself, the divisional commander whose reputation had been built on aggressive tactics and unwavering discipline. Patterson was a soldier's soldier, a man who had earned his stars through personal courage and tactical brilliance. But he was also the architect of an attack plan that would have made good sense on a staff college map, and absolutely none on actual terrain where real soldiers would really die. "Colonel Morrison, this is General Patterson. You are now 15 minutes overdue on a direct attack order. I want an immediate explanation and immediate compliance. Your regiment's failure to advance is compromising the entire divisional operation. Acknowledge and execute immediately." The words carried the full weight of military justice. Patterson wasn't just demanding obedience, he was creating a legal record that would support court-martial proceedings. Every word was being recorded, every moment of delay documented for the tribunal that would inevitably follow. Morrison was painting himself into a corner that would likely end with him in a federal prison, stripped of rank and pension, branded forever as the colonel who refused to fight when his country called. But something extraordinary was happening throughout the 422nd's positions. Word was spreading through the intricate network of whispers and hand signals that connects soldiers in combat zones. The attack had been delayed. No one knew why, but experienced sergeants and veteran corporals began to understand that their colonel was buying them time for reasons he couldn't explain over monitored radio channels. Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto, understanding more than he dared to acknowledge, began implementing what military manuals called defensive improvements to existing positions. If his men weren't advancing, they might as well dig deeper foxholes and improve their fields of fire. It was perfectly legitimate military activity that happened to make an assault even less likely as each minute passed. Major Chen, acting on Morrison's silent approval, began dispatching reconnaissance patrols to gather additional intelligence on enemy positions. The patrols would take hours to complete their missions, providing further justification for delaying any assault until more complete information was available. It was military bureaucracy transformed into a life-saving art form. Meanwhile, in divisional headquarters, 30 miles away, staff officers scrambled to understand why their most reliable regiment had suddenly become insubordinate. Maps were consulted, radio logs reviewed, weather reports analyzed. Some officers suggested that Morrison might be dealing with communication problems or unexpected tactical developments. Others whispered that the Japanese-American colonel might be showing his true colors under pressure, but General Patterson knew better. He had served with Morrison in North Africa, had seen him lead desperate attacks against impossible odds. This wasn't cowardice or ethnic disloyalty. This was the experienced combat commander refusing to execute orders that violated every principle of sound military leadership. Patterson faced his own terrible choice: relieve Morrison immediately and find another colonel willing to sacrifice the 442nd, or find ways to save face while quietly abandoning an attack plan that had been doomed from the high-fee moment it left the planning room. At 6:30 a.m., exactly 30 minutes after the scheduled assault time, something unprecedented happened. Morrison finally picked up the radio microphone, but not to order an attack. Instead, he began transmitting detailed tactical reports that painted a picture of German strength far beyond anything headquarters had imagined. Eagle Base, this is Bushido 6. Recent reconnaissance indicates enemy strength significantly greater than initial estimates. German positions include previously unidentified artillery observation posts with direct fire capability on all potential assault routes. Request permission to conduct additional reconnaissance before proceeding with planned operations. It was masterful military language, technically accurate, procedurally correct, and absolutely devastating to any argument for immediate assault. Morrison was using the system's own requirements against itself, demanding the kind of thorough preparation that proper military doctrine required. But battlefield urgency rarely allowed. More importantly, Morrison was gambling that General Patterson retained enough tactical sense to recognize suicide when it was presented in proper military terminology. The reconnaissance reports weren't fabricated. They were simply complete, detailing every machine gun nest, every mortar position, every advantage the Germans held over attackers who would be advancing uphill across open ground. For 27 minutes, Morrison transmitted the most thorough tactical assessment any divisional headquarters had ever received from a frontline commander. He described fields of fire, defensive positions, probable casualty rates, and alternative approaches with the precision of a professor lecturing at the War College. Each detail reinforced the same conclusion: the planned assault would accomplish nothing except the systematic destruction of America's most decorated regiment. General Patterson listened to every word, understanding that Morrison was offering him an exit strategy disguised as a situation report. The colonel was providing his superior with enough tactical justification to postpone or cancel the attack, without admitting that the original plan had been conceived by men who had never seen the terrain they were so eager to assault. At 7 a.m., after an hour of silence that had saved 3,000 lives, General Patterson's voice crackled through the radio with new orders. Bushido 6, based on your tactical assessment, you are authorized to postpone assault operations pending arrival of additional artillery support, maintain defensive positions, and continue reconnaissance activities. It was face-saving language that acknowledged reality without admitting error. The attack was cancelled without being cancelled, postponed indefinitely, while staff officers quietly developed alternative plans that might actually work. Morrison had won his gamble, but at a cost that would follow him for the rest of his military career. As word spread through the regiment that the suicidal assault had been called off, soldiers who had been preparing to die began preparing to live. Equipment was redistributed, positions improved, and letters home rewritten to include plans for the future rather than final farewells. But Morrison knew that his hour of silence would follow him forever. He had proven that sometimes the greatest act of military leadership was knowing when not to lead, when to choose silence over obedience, when to risk everything on the belief that soldiers' lives were worth more than staff officers' reputations. The aftermath of Morrison's refusal to speak would ripple through military institutions for decades, challenging fundamental assumptions about command authority and moral responsibility in warfare. What began as one colonel's desperate attempt to save his regiment became a case study in military academies worldwide, forcing a generation of officers to confront uncomfortable questions about when obedience becomes complicity in preventable tragedy. Within hours of the cancelled assault, field telephones throughout the European theatre carried whispered conversations about the Japanese-American colonel who had defied direct orders and somehow avoided court-martial. Stories spread through officers' clubs and command bunkers about Morrison's hour of silence, growing more dramatic with each retelling, but always returning to the same central truth. Sometimes the most courageous thing a leader can do is absolutely nothing. The official records would sanitize the incident, describing tactical delays due to unfavorable conditions and incomplete intelligence. Morrison's fitness reports would note his thorough approach to operational planning, without mentioning his refusal to execute orders that would have decimated his command. But among professional soldiers who understood the reality behind diplomatic language, Morrison's reputation grew beyond anything medals or promotions could have provided. General Patterson, facing pressure from his own superiors to explain the operational delays, made a decision that revealed his own character under pressure. Instead of scapegoating Morrison for insubordination, he endorsed the colonel's tactical assessment and formally recommended against future frontal assaults on similar terrain. Patterson understood that Morrison had saved not just 3,000 lives, but his own reputation as a commander who valued results over body counts. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team would go on to become the most decorated unit in American military history, earning their honors through tactical brilliance rather than suicidal courage. Morrison's men fought with the desperate valor of soldiers who understood that their officers valued their lives enough to risk careers protecting them. The trust between commanders and troops that grew from that October morning would carry the regiment through battles that required genuine heroism rather than pointless sacrifice. But the deeper implications of Morrison's silence extended far beyond military effectiveness. His refusal to speak had demonstrated that the chain of command was not a suicide pact, that military discipline could coexist with moral responsibility, and that sometimes the system itself needed protection from its own worst impulses. Staff colleges began incorporating case studies of tactical disobedience into their curricula, teaching future officers that blind obedience could be as dangerous as outright cowardice. Morrison himself never spoke publicly about his decision during the war, maintaining the professional discretion that had made his silence so powerful. But decades later, in interviews conducted for military historians, he would describe the longest hour of his life with the understated precision that characterized everything about his leadership style. "I couldn't find words that would make 3,000 unnecessary deaths seem reasonable," he said in 1989, 45 years after the incident. "Sometimes a commander's most important decision is knowing when not to decide, when to let silence speak louder than any order." The veterans of the 442nd would remember October 14, 1944, not as the day they failed to attack, but as the day their colonel proved that leadership meant more than following orders. Reunion speeches would refer to Morrison's tactical genius and operational insight, but the men who had crouched in foxholes waiting for orders that never came understood the deeper truth. Their colonel had loved them enough to risk everything protecting them from senseless death. Modern military doctrine now includes provisions for what scholars call constructive disobedience, the principle that officers have not just the right but the responsibility to question orders that serve no valid military purpose. Morrison's silence had become institutionalized, transformed from individual moral courage into systematic protection against the kind of tactical insanity that had characterized too much of military history. But perhaps the most profound legacy of that October morning was its demonstration that silence could be more powerful than speech, that sometimes the greatest act of communication was the decision not to communicate at all. In an institution built on verbal orders and written directives, Morrison had proven that the absence of words could carry more meaning than any command ever issued. Today, when military academies teach leadership to young officers who will face impossible choices in future conflicts, Morrison's hour of silence serves as a reminder that authority must be tempered by wisdom, that obedience must be balanced by moral responsibility, and that sometimes the most important orders are the ones that are never given. The 3,000 men who lived because their colonel chose silence over speech went on to raise families, build businesses, and contribute to American society in ways that would have been impossible if they had died charging up a hillside in eastern France. Their children and grandchildren represent Morrison's true legacy, not the military honors he might have earned through conventional heroism, but the lives he saved through the unconventional heroism of strategic silence. In the end, Morrison's decision proved that sometimes the greatest military victories are the battles that are never fought, the orders that are never given, and the silence that speaks louder than the thunder of artillery. His refusal to speak had saved more than lives. It had preserved the principle that military service means protecting something larger than military tradition itself. History would remember October 14, 1944, as the day when silence became the most eloquent statement ever made about the value of human life in the machinery of war.